Hey guys! Tonight we're diving into one of the stranger detours in Greek mythology, a divine side hustle involving stingers, smoke, and a surprising amount of honey. You're on a dusty trail winding up the side of Mount Hymettus, the thyme-scented, air humming with bees. The sun's high, too high, really, and it's being dragged there by none other than Apollo himself. Yes, that Apollo. God of music, prophecy, healing, and apparently, beekeeping? You probably won't survive this version of Greek mythology either. Too much sun exposure, zero sunscreen, and a serious risk of divine micromanagement. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing how far this sleepy little corner of the internet stretches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey, together. It all begins, as many mythological side quests do, with boredom. Apollo had done it all. He'd slain the Python, built temples, founded oracles, and played his lyre better than anyone else on Olympus. He was tired of winning singing contests against satyrs. Honestly, he was tired of satyrs in general. What's left for a solar deity? With flawless cheekbones and a portfolio full of prophecies. That's when he noticed the bees. Not just noticed, fixated. Historians still argue whether Apollo's obsession with bees stemmed from their symbolism, they were sacred to Artemis, and to Demeter too, or whether he just liked the taste of wild, thyme honey. Either way, one morning he declared to absolutely no one, "I shall keep bees now. No divine omens, no heavenly mandates, just vibes." So you're walking beside him now, sandals dusty, dodging rocks as he scouts the hills around. Athens. Mount Hymettus is the perfect place, famous even in ancient times for its aromatic herbs and industrious bees. You catch a whiff of sage. A few bees bump gently into your shoulders, then spiral upward, busy and unbothered. Apollo's dressed in, gleaming white, of course, completely impractical. But the god seems undeterred by the dust. "I shall build the finest hive Greece has ever known," he says, absolutely certain, "and the bees shall sing for me." You don't ask how that's supposed to work. According to one obscure fragment of Hesiodic poetry, Apollo once referred to honey as Ambrosia's second cousin. That tracks. The gods mostly ate ambrosia and nectar, but honey had this mortal sweetness he found, grounding. Or, as he put it, "It reminds me I'm adored by everyone, even insects." It was the height of summer. The light was strong enough to bleach marble, and Apollo was glowing like someone had over-polished him. He paused by a thyme bush, crouched, and listened to the buzzing with his eyes closed. "Do you hear it?" he whispered. "They're harmonizing in D major." You don't. You just hear bees, a lot of bees, possibly judging you. Still, he seems determined. And when a god decides something, you mostly nod and hope it doesn't involve turning into a tree or being cursed for eternity. This seems harmless enough. Bees are cute, right? Apollo spent the next few days entirely too committed to the project. He sketched hive designs in the sand. He carved patterns into olive wood panels. At one point, he tried to commission Hephaestus for a gold-plated apiary, until the god of the forge reminded him that bees don't enjoy boiling to death. Fun fact, ancient Greeks did, in fact, keep bees in ceramic and woven hives. They called them kypselae, and they were often shaped like flower pots. Honey was prized not just as a sweetener, but as medicine, and it had deep ties to ritual, used in offerings to the gods and the dead alike. Apollo's version, though, was slightly more performative. He eventually settled on a location, a soft slope dotted with thyme and myrtle, shaded just enough to keep the hives cool. The air was thick with humming, and you, you lucky assistant, were handed a miniature lyre and told to play soothing chords but not too well. Because the bees were sensitive, Apollo placed the first hive himself, delicately brushing away a curious cicada. He spoke to the bees like tiny golden priestesses. "Bring me your wisdom, your sweetness, your bee-ishness." You stifle a laugh. Bees don't like sarcasm. But here's a curious tidbit. In some lost Orphic hymns, bees were thought to carry the souls of the wise, flitting between the mortal world and the divine. They were liminal, like Hermes, but smaller and fuzzier. Apollo may have been on to something, or just winging it, which honestly describes most gods on their day off. The first night, he dreams of golden rivers and bees that whisper secrets in ancient tongues. He wakes up convinced that the honey will contain visions, just like his sacred spring at Delphi. You're not sure. You're pretty sure the bees just want pollen. Still, there's something comforting about the repetition. The daily check on the hives, the scent of wax and wildflowers, the soft clatter of ceramic jars being filled with honey so thick it glows. Apollo hums while working, a low, resonant tone that vibrates through the thyme stalks. This is a very weird summer. One morning you spot him standing motionless as bees land on his hands and face. He doesn't flinch. "They trust me now," he says. "I am their son." You say nothing. You're too distracted by the bee currently exploring your sandal. Later that day, Hermes shows up and says, "So you're doing bugs now?" Apollo glares. The experiment continues, and you're right in the middle of it. The sun climbs higher each day, baking the hillsides of Mount Hymettus into a mosaic of dusty greens and soft golden browns. Apollo, still radiant and absolutely overdressed for manual labor, has settled into his role as divine beekeeper with unsettling enthusiasm. Today's task? Naming the bees, yes. Naming them. Not the species, not the hives, each individual bee. He gestures at a thick blur of buzzing wings and declares, "That one is Melodia, and over there, that fast one, Euphania." You try to point out the obvious. Logistical flaws. There are thousands of them. But he's already deep into a naming trance, muttering monikers like Harmonides and Stingster. Historians still argue whether this was symbolic, a metaphor for his desire to control nature, or if he just had too much free time. Either way, by the end of the morning, he insists that the bees are beginning to respond to their names. One even does a little loop-the-loop, which Apollo interprets as agreement. That particular bee is immediately dubbed Melisma. While he's busy assigning another handful of names, you glance around the camp. The hives are thriving, beautiful terracotta constructions set neatly among the herbs. The scent is sweet, warm, and earthy, tinged with smoke from a lazy cedar fire. Nearby, a stone basin has been filled with water and tiny floating corks, so the bees don't drown while drinking. Apollo says it's a spa for their little legs. You don't know how bee legs work, but you're oddly touched. A few elderly shepherds have wandered by, curious. They've seen plenty in their years, plagues, oracles, wars, but not usually. A sun god trying to coach bees in choral harmony. Apollo greets them with casual divinity. "Would you care to sample my preliminary batch?" He offers a small clay pot, delicately sealed with wax. The shepherds taste it, nod slowly, and one of them says, "Not bad, little time heavy." Apollo beams. Here's your mainstream fact of the day. The ancient Greeks were some of the earliest organized beekeepers. They domesticated bees in clay hives, harvested both honey and wax, and considered beekeeping a refined, almost philosophical task. Honey was used in everything from wound treatment to cake batter to embalming fluid, and if you were wealthy enough, you didn't collect your own. You employed someone like you. A lowly mortal with a netted veil and constant sting paranoia, Apollo naturally skips the veil. You, on the other hand, have developed an increasingly aggressive shoulder twitch whenever you hear buzzing. By late afternoon, the god insists it's time for bee training. This is not a euphemism. He crouches near the largest hive and begins plucking a soft, rhythmic tune on his lyre. The melody is light, airy, something between a lullaby and a warm breeze through wheat. He hums along gently, watching the hive entrance like a proud father at a school recital. To your alarm, a few bees actually emerge. They hover mid-air, wobbling slightly, then float in place. Apollo continues to play. The buzzing changes pitch, less frantic, more tonal. See, he says, eyes gleaming. They resonate. You squint, you hear bees. But maybe there's a kind of pattern. According to a very niche school of Pythagorean thought, bees were tiny mathematicians, aligning their buzz frequencies with the sacred harmonies of the cosmos. It's not a mainstream belief, sure, but it's one Apollo is happy to embrace. He spends the rest of the evening sketching musical notation based on bee flight patterns. He titles it Symphony for Six Wings and an Irritated Assistant. You don't get a royalty credit, but even you have to admit something odd is happening. The bees seem calmer around him. Not tame, exactly, but aware. He moves slowly, speaks softly, and when he opens a hive to check the combs, they don't swarm. They hum, like they're singing back. Later, as the stars rise and the night air cools, you sit beside the glowing embers of the fire. Apollo tunes his lyre and muses aloud. What if honey contains memories? What if each drop holds a poem of the flower it came from? You nod slowly, not because you believe him, but because it's late and your brain is melting. He continues. Bees navigate by dancing. Maybe they dream in rhythm. You consider this. You also consider that you haven't seen him sleep in 4 days. Still, you begin to suspect that there's more to this hobby than just the honey. Apollo seems gentler here, less consumed with being the best or being worshipped. Out here, with the bees, he's just curious. Quirky fringe tidbit. Some ancient sources describe Apollo's sacred connection not only to bees, but to the mysterious Threae, 3 prophetic bee women who lived on Mount Parnassus. They gave omens in riddles, and some myths claim they taught Apollo the art of divination itself. This would explain a lot. It also adds to his belief that bees are more than insects. To him, they're tiny oracles. You're not sure they agree. Still, you begin to feel the pull of the rhythm. The steady buzz, the whisper of wings, the warm, viscous drip of honey from freshly cut combs. It's hypnotic. That night, your dreams are sweet and golden. You float on a river of nectar. Somewhere in the distance, a lyre plays, and bees dance in patterns above your head, spelling messages you can't quite read. You wake before dawn to find Apollo already up, scribbling furiously in a wax tablet. I had a vision, he says. The bees showed me. You ask what it was. He pauses. I think I need more hives. Of course he does. The next morning, your joints protest as you wake up on what is essentially a repurposed goat blanket. The sun hasn't even crested the hills, and Apollo is already pacing, hair immaculate, robes suspiciously unsullied, holding a long, crudely sketched blueprint for what appears to be a bee amphitheater? He taps the scroll excitedly. This section is for rehearsal. That corner? Nectar bar. And over here, VIP seats for the queens. You stare at the parchment. It looks like a beehive mated with the Parthenon and then fell. Down a flight of stairs. You gently suggest just building more hives. Apollo, disappointed but open to compromise, agrees to start with 3. You spend the rest of the morning hauling sun-baked clay cylinders up the slope. They're heavier than they look, and absolutely full of the kind of damp-smelling mystery that says, you might find a snake in here. Apollo watches while occasionally lifting a single pebble and offering very helpful design critiques like, let's make it more divine. Here's a mainstream fact to chew on while your shoulders die. In classical Greece, cylindrical hives made from unbaked clay and wicker were the standard. They were stacked horizontally with one open end and a removable backplate for honey. Collection. This setup allowed beekeepers to harvest honey without entirely destroying the hive, a definite upgrade from earlier methods, which involved setting the whole thing on fire and hoping for the best. By midday, the new hives are in place, shaded by a few scraggly olive trees. Apollo performs a short, impromptu blessing over them. He waves his hands, hums a few notes, and dramatically sprinkles a handful of wild thyme. You're about to ask if this counts as agricultural malpractice when a bee lands calmly on your wrist and just sits there, not stinging, not panicking, just observing you with what feels like the gentle curiosity of a very small librarian. Apollo nods solemnly. She approves. You name her Cleo. That afternoon, as the bees adjust to their new homes, Apollo decides to host what he calls a bee symposium. This involves him reclining on a stone bench, sipping watered wine, and launching into a philosophical monologue directed entirely at the insects. Behold the geometry of your hexagons, he proclaims. Each cell, a miniature cathedral of symmetry. You lie back in the grass, halfway between sleep and sunstroke. The bees drone softly overhead. Apollo waxes poetic about nectar politics, queen dynamics, and the ethics of drone labor. Occasionally, he quotes Sappho. And here's your quirky tidbit. The Greeks believed that honey could transmit divine inspiration. The term Melissa, Greek, for bee, was also a title for priestesses of Demeter and Artemis. These women, known for their discipline and trance-like states, were thought to be bee-possessed, buzzing with sacred insight. In some versions, even the oracle at Delphi was originally a bee woman. So yes, Apollo's bug lecture might be more theological than you realized. As the heat fades and evening rises, he picks up his lyre again and says, I want to teach them. Rhythm. You suggest maybe they've got rhythm covered? He smiles. But do they have swing? He plays a jaunty tune, a mix of scales and syncopation that sounds oddly jazzy for a god who predates jazz. A few bees swirl in a lazy spiral. Apollo grins, convinced it's working. Historians still argue whether Apollo's musical experimentation had any real effect on the bees, or if it was just confirmation bias wrapped in divine ego. But you have to admit, things are changing. The hives hum at dusk. Not the erratic buzz of disturbed insects, but something low and steady, like a lullaby wrapped in wings. Even you feel it. A pulse in the air, like warm honey spreading across your skin. You sit beneath the olive tree, watching the light fade into a syrupy pink. A gentle breeze carries the scent of thyme and smoke. A bee lands on the rim of your cup, sips delicately, and departs. And for a moment you wonder, are they listening? Apollo certainly thinks so. He turns to you and says, next we introduce choreography. You groan. He's serious. By twilight, he's sketching diagrams in the dirt, tiny flight paths, figure eights, crescendos. You mutter that maybe bees have their own ways of communicating, like, say, actual dances, Apollo pauses. Do they? Oh, I suppose I should observe that. To your dismay, this leads to several hours of intense bee-watching. You both lie flat on your stomachs near the hive entrances, faces inches from the traffic. Apollo holds a stylus and wax tablet, scribbling furiously every time a bee does a little wiggle. He names the most active one Thespis and insists it's a natural performer. You mumble that Thespis was the first actor in Greek theater. Apollo beams. Exactly. That night, as you settle into your bed of increasingly pointy moss, you're too tired to argue. You close your eyes to the now familiar hum of bee wings and lyre strings. The sky is velvet dark. Stars flicker gently above. You dream of hexagons. of bees in togas, of Apollo, directing a musical with a cast of 10,000 winged extras. When you wake, he's already carving a sign. Theater of the Bee, matinee daily. Of course he is. You spend the next morning gathering materials for the theater's infrastructure, which, in Apollo's mind, consists mostly of ornamental laurel wreaths for the hives and tiny lyre motifs carved into stone. You try to explain that bees are unlikely to appreciate Doric columns, but Apollo insists they're aesthetic creatures. As you lug another armful of ivy and terracotta tiles up the slope, you briefly consider feigning a twisted ankle. But then a bee buzzes past your ear and lands squarely on a laurel wreath, balancing perfectly before zooming off again, as if inspecting your work. You sigh. Critique noted. Apollo is humming again, this time a more upbeat tune with a suspiciously catchy chorus. You recognize it from the day before. Thespis's theme, he's calling it now. By midday, he's convinced the bees are responding. He points to a small group executing tight loops above a patch of wildflowers. "Look!" he shouts. "That's Act 1. You say it looks more like they found a particularly fragrant patch of oregano. But here's a mainstream historical fact that complicates things. Ancient Greek scholars like Aristotle were among the first to attempt a scientific understanding of bee behavior. In Historia Animalium, Aristotle observed bee dances, though he didn't quite interpret them correctly, and speculated on the existence of a king bee, which we now know is actually a queen. Still, for the 4th century BCE, he was surprisingly close. Apollo, naturally, has no such confusion. "Queen Metha," he says, naming the largest bee in Hive 3. "She has presence, gravitas. I may write an ode. You suggest letting the bees just do their thing." "Impossible," he replies, holding up a palm. "The arts wait for no insect." Later that day, you stumble upon a strange little bundle tucked near the hive entrance, a bit of bark, some thistle fluff, and 3 tiny pebbles. You show it to Apollo, who nods solemnly. "An offering." "To whom?" you ask. "To me, obviously." He insists it's their first gift of gratitude. You point out that it might also be windblown debris. But Apollo is already composing a thank you hymn. And now for your quirky tidbit. In some obscure strands of Greek myth, bees are described not merely as insects, but as divine messengers, psychopomps even, carrying souls between realms. The Melissae, as mentioned earlier, were believed to have powers of prophecy and transformation. One odd Orphic fragment even suggests that bees could whisper secrets of the underworld into the ears of sleeping initiates. So when Apollo kneels beside the hive at twilight and murmurs, "What truths do you carry, little ones?" it's only a little absurd. You half expect the bees to answer back in choral harmony. They don't. But one lands on his nose. That evening, he unveils what he calls the Bee Chorus Platform. It's a flat slab of limestone decorated with spirals facing the western sun, where rehearsals will now take place. You ask what the performance is actually about. "Existence," he says dramatically. "Nectar, longing, the tension between sting and sweetness." You suppress a snort. Apollo eyes you sideways. "You'll see." The rehearsals begin at dusk. He plays a gentle looping melody on his lyre, barely more than a whisper. Around him, the bees swirl, not chaotically, but rhythmically, as if orbiting some invisible sun. It's oddly hypnotic. Even you, hardened skeptic of divine apiary choreography, feel yourself relaxing into the rhythm, the music, the scent of crushed thyme beneath your fingers, the warm gold of last light reflecting off honeycombed stone. Everything slows. And just as you're drifting into that pleasant midsummer evening daze, he pulls out the incense. It's strong, pungent, something between cinnamon and wildfire, traditional, Apollo claims. A gift from Hermes. helps focus the swarm. You cough. The bees do not appear to enjoy it. They scatter, whirling upward in a disorganized cloud. Apollo sighs. Too soon. They're not ready for Act 3. You mutter something unkind about avant-garde art and wave smoke from your face. Historians still argue whether ritual incense in ancient Greece had tangible effects on wildlife, or if it was more symbolic, a sensory bridge between the mortal and divine. In temple ceremonies, though, smoke was believed to purify the space and elevate prayers, and in this case, it definitely elevates your eyebrows. Later that night, the two of you lie on your backs in the grass again, the bees finally calm, the sky velvet and still. Apollo is unusually quiet. Then he says, "Do you think it's foolish?" You blink. What? The bee opera? He nods. Trying to share something vast through something so small. You think for a moment, watching a lone bee spiral toward the moon. Maybe, but it's also kind of beautiful. He smiles. You understand, and you do. Somehow, even if it's wrapped in divine ego and pollen. Before sleep claims you, you hear him softly plucking strings, one by one, a lullaby for bees and mortals alike. Somewhere in the hive, Thespis buzzes approval. You wake to the smell of thyme and something else, something rich and sugary. You blink against the morning light and sit up to see Apollo, wearing what appears to be a golden apron, stirring a bubbling cauldron with exaggerated grace. "I'm making honey cakes," he announces, not looking up. Art needs snacks. You shuffle toward the fire, still rubbing sleep from your eyes. "Since when do you cook?" "Since Dionysus mocked me for only knowing how to sing about flavors, not create them." He pauses to flick flour from his sleeve. Besides, bees respond better to encouragement than criticism. The cakes are round, slightly singed at the edges, and fragrant with lavender. You bite into one experimentally. It's actually good. Infuriatingly good. Apollo beams. Knew I still had the touch. Now, honey cakes weren't just a divine whimsy. There's a mainstream historical fact for you. In ancient Greece, they were frequently offered to the gods during household rituals and larger festivals alike. Simple in ingredients: flour, honey, oil. They were thought to sweeten divine moods and smooth the path between mortal and celestial spheres. This morning, though, the honey cakes are clearly intended for the bees. Apollo carefully breaks one into thumbnail-sized portions, places them on a ceramic tray, and sets it in front of the hive with the solemnity of a high priest. "You can't bribe bees," you tell him. "They're not bribes," he corrects. "They're dramaturgical morale boosters." You roll your eyes. The bees, to their credit, seem interested. A few land, circle the crumbs, then dart back to the hive. Within minutes, a procession has formed, tiny, orderly, and somehow smug. You imagine them whispering to one another, "Finally some respect around here." Later that day, rehearsals resume. Apollo has composed a new aria for Thespis, involving a high-pitched hum and several improvised wing beats. You're instructed to hold a bronze cymbal and strike it softly when he raises one eyebrow. You miss the first cue, and the second. Eventually, you're demoted to tree. That's right. You stand beside the stage holding a garland and swaying rhythmically, meant to evoke a sacred grove. Apollo says you bring gravity to the tableau. You suspect he just doesn't want you touching instruments anymore. Still, the production evolves. Apollo begins dividing the bees into groups, each with designated flight paths and musical motifs. There's the pollen corps, the chorus of the 5 petals, and something he calls the nectar tragedians, who only appear at dusk. You start keeping a journal of their movements, not for artistic reasons, but because it's oddly relaxing. There's something deeply soothing about the patterns, the figure 8s, the waggle dances, the spirals at dusk. You lose whole afternoons this way, sketching and annotating with ink-stained fingers. And here comes your quirky tidbit. In certain strands of Mediterranean folklore, bees were believed to be the only creatures capable of bridging the earthly and divine realms without punishment. In fact, there were customs in which families would whisper major life updates, births, deaths, weddings, directly to their hives, as if bees were sacred confidants. This was known in some areas as telling the bees, so when Apollo leans toward the hive one morning and murmurs, "We open next week," it doesn't feel as silly as it should. In the evenings, he recites verses to them. You catch lines like, "O golden ones, dancers of time, lords of the lightless temple." You're not sure if the bees are following along, but they seem calm, almost reverent. One lands gently on your forehead and sits there for a full 10 seconds. You take this as a nod of approval, or maybe a very tiny crown. Historians still argue whether these sorts of rituals around bees were actual religious observances or metaphorical expressions of respect for nature. Either way, in the ancient world, bees occupied a strangely sacred space. Not quite divine, but never merely insects. And it's hard to ignore how everything begins to revolve around them now. Your meals, your music, even your sleep schedule are dictated by hive rhythms. You know when Queen Maythe emerges by the angle of her shadow. You can predict a swarm by the change in vibration under your feet. One afternoon, you catch Apollo polishing a miniature throne. "For Her Majesty," he says, without irony. The throne is carved from olive wood, adorned with mother-of-pearl chips and bound in vine. It's ludicrous. And yet, when he places it gently in the hive's entrance chamber, the bees gather around it like pilgrims. You sit beside him in the dirt, back against a sun-warmed rock. The air buzzes, not just with insects, but with expectation. They'll "Remember this," Apollo whispers. "Long after we're gone," you snort. "You're immortal," he shrugs. "Even we fade eventually." And somehow, that hits you harder than expected. That night you dream of golden spirals, of music and pollen, of wings brushing your cheeks like blessings. When you wake, the first thing you hear is applause. Bee applause. You tell yourself it's just the wind, but deep down, you wonder.